SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning. Welcome to the third lecture of third week of this ongoing online course on understanding and reducing GHG emissions. We are focusing on scope 1 and 2 emission reduction through building design and construction, and this is the lecture 13th or third lecture of third week, where we are going to start discussing about identification and determination of scope 1, 2 and 3 GHG emissions. Now, here in this particular lecture, we are not directly going to talk about scope 1, 2 and 3 GHG emissions. Before we do that, we are going to identify the organizational and operational boundaries, which we had briefly introduced in the previous lecture of yesterday. Once we have understood the boundaries, then we can talk about the scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, and it will be very clear. So, we are going to continue this particular lecture tomorrow when we move from understanding the boundaries to identifying scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So, yesterday we were talking about the ISO 14064, its structure, description, the benefits, the framework, how it works, and there one aspect that we had clearly identified was to how to identify the boundaries, the organizational boundaries. So, today in this particular lecture we are going to cover the first 3 points, which is introduction, where to act and how to act. And if you remember our discussion yesterday, we clearly discussed that 14064, ISO 14064 and GHG protocol, they are complementary to each other, and while the 14064 talks about what to do, the GHG protocol clearly talks about how to do it. So, this is what we are going to see, that how we define these boundaries and go about it. So, quickly giving you an overview that GHG protocol, the corporate standard we are talking about, it defines the it classifies the company's GHG emissions into 3 scopes, scope 1, 2 and 3, and that I had told you towards the end of yesterday's lecture also, that scope 1 is the direct emission from owned or controlled sources. Scope 2 is the indirect emission, that is resulting from the purchased energy, and rest of the indirect emissions we are putting in scope 3, both for downstream and upstream operations in the value chain of the company. So, with this we have to clearly understand that how do we actually develop the GHG inventory, and for that we have to see that what is the boundary. Now, if we look at these 4 steps which we had discussed earlier too, we have clearly this discussion where we know that step 1 and 2 is defining where to act, which is we have to set up these boundaries, we have to know where to act, and for that we have to identify the boundaries and the inventories within them. Once we have done that, that is when we will go to the second step, which is how to act, where we will then develop a management plan for the inventory. So, we already know what is the boundary, what are the inventories within that, and we have collected the data related to these inventories. This is where to act, and how to act. Once we have the data and the inventories in place, we will know how to manage those inventories, and then we set a GHG emission reduction target. So, from the baseline year which we had discussed to the target year, how much should be the reduction will come in this step 4 once we know how to manage the inventory. So, these are the 4 basic steps. Now, let us begin with the steps one by one. So, we are talking about where to act first. So, the first thing is to identify the scope and plan the inventory. So, here we are actually determining and defining the organizational and operational boundaries, which is the most important thing, and once we do that, after that we choose a baseline year, we have to define that, which we had discussed earlier also, and we also have to consider the third party verification and validation for this inventory. So, the first thing which is most important is to identify what are your boundaries, what do you consider as the company's assets and resources. So, very broadly if we look, for example, we have a parent company here and it has several subsidiary companies, company A, B, C, D. Now, this entire thing is within the organizational boundary. So, all the assets which are owned by these companies also are going to be considered as part of the organizational boundary for the parent company. So, the parent company could be a very big company and there could be subsidiary companies, smaller companies dealing with specific products or specific services. All these companies and their assets where the operations are happening are part of the organizational boundary, and where the operations are happening, that goes into the operational boundaries. For example, there is a controlled building which is owned by whatever company. It could be owned by several companies, different buildings owned by several companies. These are all part of operational boundary. So, when we are calculating the direct emissions, we are actually looking at the emissions happening within the operational boundary, and when we are looking at the value chain, the entire value chain, we are looking at the entire organizational boundary. So, the people traveling, so we may have the persons traveling, which is an indirect emission going to the scope 3. So, these are the indirect emissions which are happening. The employee is going to meet some prospective client or going for some business meeting. So, the emissions which are resulting from that are coming within the organizational structure, the entire organization of the company, and that will go in the third category, the indirect emissions from the downstream operations. So, this is what we have to first understand, that what all is part of the organization and what all is part of the operations. I will give you an example. For example, IIT Roorkee has 3 campuses. IIT Roorkee has IIT Roorkee main campus, which is situated in IIT Roorkee, and it also has another campus in Saharanpur and a third campus in Greater Noida. Now, as an organization, we have these 3 campuses. Okay. Now, all the emissions which are directly resulting from these 3 are part of this organization itself, and when we go operations within these specific ones, we will get the direct emissions, and we will also get the indirect emissions from the organization of these 3 campuses, which is part of IIT Roorkee as a parent organization. This is what we are talking about. So, while for smaller companies, for example, a single industry unit, for example, a small industrial unit, manufacturing unit is there, which has only one plant which is operating and one corporate office. This is all this particular company has. So, this organization is very small and its operations are also happening here, but consider a very large company, for example say an oil selling company, a fuel selling company. Now, that is having its operations in different geographic locations, and it is just operations in terms of extraction of oil, or maybe if it owns, but the bigger network is of its sellers. Thousands of outlets across the world are selling fuel. Now, all these are also part of the operational boundary. Now, within that, we have to see, and we will go in detail over this too, that how many of these assets are fully under the control of the company, owned by the company, or how many of these are going to be leased by somebody else, or there might also be a franchisee option. So, what are those equity holdings? That is what we have to see when we go into organization as well as operations boundaries, but everything wherever the company is having a control and its delivering the product or its operating is all within the organizational boundary and the operating boundary. So, we cannot neglect or ignore any part which is directly getting affected by company's decisions or is contributing to the company's growth out of either of the two boundaries. So, that is what we have to see. Now, if we look at the organization boundary broadly, there are two approaches. One is a control approach and the other one is an equity share approach. Currently, the reporting, GHG emission reporting requires a company to follow either one of the approach, but to actually account for, or rather to follow the principle of completeness in GHG emissions, a company is required to follow both the approaches and report and define its organizational boundary based upon both the approaches. But currently GHG emission for now requires a company to define its organization boundary based upon any one approach, either control approach or equity share approach. Now, control approach is again, it could be two way, but when a company chooses control approach, they have to go ahead both with operational as well as financial. So, operational approach is where the company has 100% control over the operations of a subsidiary company or anything working under it, that is called an operational approach. And financial approach is where again the company has complete control of its financial operations. So, that is where it is known as financial control approach. Now, there could be a possibility that the operational control or the financial control of the subsidiary company or the end organization partly is getting controlled by the parent company. For example, if I am a manufacturing company, for example, I am an automobile manufacturing company, I might be buying smaller parts from some smaller vendor. I may not have any control over this particular vendor as far as its operations are concerned. But when it comes to financial control, I might have an agreement with the company saying for the next 3 years, this smaller vendor is going to manufacture this particular part only for my automobile company, and I will be driving its financial operations and I will be controlling its financial operations, because I have signed this MOU that he can make parts only for my company and no other company for this particular duration or something like that. There I have some financial control over the operations of that company. In that case, the emissions resulting from this company, the company which is there in my value chain of my company, the emissions resulting from that are also going to accrue to the parent company. There could be another scenario that I am only buying the part. So, the order is given and the part is delivered by the company, but it is not bound to manufacture only for the parent automobile manufacturing company. In that case, there is no financial control. The same is with operational control. If I have an equity investment and there the policy matters and decisions are being governed by the parent company also, then the emissions accruing from there will be added to the parent company as well. And if the decisions are not affected, the operational decisions are not affected by the parent company, then the emissions are not getting accrued to the parent company. This is how this control approach will work. So, whatever we are controlling, whether through operations or through finances, wherever whatever percentage of control we have as a parent company, the emissions are going to accrue to the parent company. Now, a lot of places, whenever we are talking about MNCs and bigger companies, for quality check and quality assurance, we have often some equity stake, financial equity stake and operational, thereby giving us the operational rights and also control over the activities. There the emissions will also accrue. I can give you several examples to understand this. For example, if you would see some clothing companies, some big brands, any big brand for that matter, they do not manufacture their cloth line entirely. Some manufacturing units might be owned by them, but a lot of times the manufacturing units are somewhere in smaller developing countries. A lot of fabric is being manufactured in Bangladesh. Now, what this bigger company MNC is doing, this bigger brand is doing, that it has given a set of standards which the manufacturing company has to follow, in the sense these are standardized. So, they will buy the product from them if it passes all these checks which are there, and they will buy such a product which has qualified or passed through all those checks, but they do not interfere in how the company is operating. In that case, the emissions accruing from this smaller fabric or garment manufacturing company will not be accrued to the bigger manufacturing company. However, if the parent company or the bigger brand kind of makes it mandatory for the smaller brand to follow certain standard, for example, it says that this smaller company has to mandatorily follow ISO 9001 or has to follow ISO 14064. In that case, the emissions accruing from that, because this is kind of interfering or rather having a stake in the operations of the company, there the emissions accruing will also be partly accrued to the bigger company, the parent company. The second approach is equity share approach, which is clearly the equity which the company or the percentage of ownership that the company has in the subsidiary company or the smaller company which is supplying to the parent company. So, depending upon the percentage equity, the ownership that is there, it will have the percentage of emissions accrued to the bigger company. So, right in the beginning, the company has to decide what all is part of its organization and what percentage is part of the operations, what all is part of operations and organization, and what percentage of it is part of the operations and organization. So, for example, I have been continuously giving you this example of IT company and managing its own fleet of transportation. Now, suppose the IT company says that I do not want to own the vehicles, why should I manage it, and I lease it to some X company and I say that I want you to provide me the services for bringing my employees to the office. I do not guide or direct that you have to have a fleet of electric vehicles or conventional vehicles, and all I am doing is I have leased the service, but I have no ownership. In that case, there will be no emissions accruing from this fleet of transportation to my GHG emission set. So, I will have no control over it. However, if I have a building, I take a building on lease, or rather I own a building, for example, the bigger IT companies. So, they buy the land, they develop their own offices, corporate offices, IT offices where people are going to come, and this entire facility is 100% owned by the company. This is where we will have 100% ownership of the emissions resulting. There could be a case where we have leased the facility. In that case, depending upon the type of lease, we will have emissions accrued. There could also be the case where we are not related. For example, there is a franchisee which is only buying our product and selling, not in the case of IT company. For example, in the case of a government manufacturing company. Now, that franchisee, it is not a company owned store, it is not a company operated store. All they are doing is they are buying a franchisee, buying the product from the parent company, the bigger brand, and selling it there. In that case, the emissions accruing from that facility will not be accounted into the account of GHG emissions for the parent company. So, this is slightly tricky, but it has to be resolved right in the beginning. So, the bigger the company is, the more assets it has, and the wider it is its distribution network, we will have to invest a lot of time to understand that what are my organization boundaries. For example, if you read the protocol, and then I will give you a lot of different examples too. A very large cosmetic giant. Now, these cosmetic companies, they have their small shops, outlets almost everywhere across the world or wherever geographically they have a presence, but in each city they could have some 15 odd outlets which are which are franchisees of the company, directly operated by the company. Smaller shops, they are run by somebody else, but they are company owned or they are company operated. There all these outlets will have a direct impact on the GHG emissions. The other way is where a bigger mall purchases, has a smaller counter selling the products from this cosmetic company, but it manages everything on its own, but has just products being displayed and sold in that bigger mall. There will be no direct emissions accruing to the parent company. Now, when we are deciding this organizational boundary, we have to understand the entire value chain, and this is the first task that we have to start with, understanding the organization. So, we will have the operations of the company which are in the present here. So, we have to understand the operational carbon or the emissions accruing from operations, which is known as OpCarb. We have the upstream and downstream operations. Downstream, for example, from the running, the in use emissions. So, here we will call it as use carb and the embodied carbon. So, when we are purchasing the material, when we are purchasing the raw material, or when the procurement is being done, so that is the embodied carbon or the capital carbon. So, this is what known as cap carb. All that together is actually the carbon footprint, or we are here talking about the GHG emissions. So, from upstream to the downstream, all of it is part of the emissions or carbon footprint of the company. The only thing here would be to know which one goes where, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and in what percentage, depending upon the ownership or the equity or control that we have over this particular emission that is happening in the entire value chain. So, quickly giving you an idea of what all goes into upstream and what all goes into downstream. All the purchased goods and services, the capital goods, the fuel and energy related activities, the upstream transportation and distribution, the waste which is generated in the operations and hence requiring a treatment, the travel for businesses, the employee commuting which we have just talked about, the upstream leased assets, it is all in the upstream side of the value chain. Downstream is where we are processing the processing of sold products and use of sold products is happening, or end of life treatment of sold products, or the downstream leased assets, franchisees, investments. So, all this is downstream. So, we have from manufacturing of the goods to selling and also recycling of the goods, if that is a mandate. So, this entire is value chain. Here from procurement and manufacturing, all this is upstream, and from selling and processing the sold products is all what we are talking about as the downstream. And in between we will have the operations of the company, which will actually be resulting in the scope 1. Once we have defined the organizational boundary, which kind of includes everything, we have to set its operational boundaries. For example, if we are talking about the say a developer company, a construction company. So, we have to know where and how much is actually going in operations and which particular activity. So, for a construction company, it could be individual components, that for example, windows, how much is going in windows, or roof, or walls, or what. It could be different for different companies. So, we have to know that where exactly is the emission happening from, direct and indirect. We will talk about indirect going into scope 2 and 3 again, but here we have to clearly know that which are the direct emissions which are accruing here from my processes. This is what we will do when we set our operational boundaries, where the operations are happening. For example, if we have say airlines, air carriers. Now, for them all the emissions that are resulting from their carriers flying from one place to the other, because it is direct operations, these are the assets that they directly own. Even if they have taken these planes on lease for say another 25, 30, 40, 50 years, it is 100% with them. This asset is lying with them, it has been leased to the parent company of this airlines. So, the emissions that are accruing there, which is a direct fuel, is the direct emission that we are talking about. However, if I am say for example an academic institution, my faculty or students, they travel to attend meetings or to attend workshops, go to attend international collaboration projects, their travel is not a direct emission, it is going in the indirect emission. So, that is what we are talking about. For example, if I am a petroleum company and I extract the product, I have my own extraction wells, I process it, I clean it and then I sell it. All the emissions that are accruing from this particular product, which is the petroleum product as a fuel, these are all my direct emissions. But once I have sold that product to some other company which is running its fleet of transportation of maybe an airline carrier, the emissions that are resulting from the use of that product is not my emission. Until the selling of the product, the petroleum fuel is my emission, and once it has been sold, it is going to become the direct emission for somebody else. So, that is where we have to understand the operational boundaries of that. Once it has gone, petroleum as a fuel, and filled the tank of somebody else's fleet, the emissions are now the direct emissions for somebody else. So, this is where we have to see, and the direct emissions as well as the indirect emissions could result from anything. They could result from buildings, from manufacturing within the industry if we have a product. They could be from agriculture or forestry or other land use that we can be talking about. It could be electricity production as well as electricity consumption. So, all this could be direct as well as indirect emissions. There is no distinction. It totally depends upon our operational boundaries and our organizational boundaries, that which goes where. So, that is where the operational boundary become very, very important, so as to define that what is scope 1, scope 2 or scope 3 of the emission. We will know direct and indirect, and then within indirect we will know scope 2 and 3. Once we have selected the organizational and operational boundary, we will then select a base year. So, which year do we want to serve as the base year? As a company which is old and established, and I know that I was performing worse there, I might be choosing a baseline performance. For example, 2018 was the worst performing year I know as a company, but I decide to start accounting for GHG emissions from today. But I know, of course, as the company is growing, I know of the policy decisions and the assets that I had owned then and the processes that were going on then. So, I can choose the base year as 2018 and calculate all the greenhouse gas emissions based upon 2018 data for the baseline, and then I set a target for myself that okay, by 2030 I would have reduced the emissions from that baseline of 2018 by 50%. So, the methodology, the inventory, the organizational and operational boundary, everything would have already been defined, and the data, the first data for calculating the baseline emission would be that of 2018 data. Once we have done that, we will then continue to measure and monitor the emissions and have a target for the year 2030, that is when I have to reduce it by say 50%. So, this is what we will do, setting the boundaries and then choosing the base year. Once we have identified the base year and we have set the organizational boundary, which implies that we have already identified the inventories, because we know the organization, we know all the assets, all the resources that the company owns or controls or has an equity in, we know the inventories that will go for each activity and for each asset. For each of these inventories, if you remember the 14064, we already have some standard methodologies for accounting for each of these inventories. We will select those methods, and once we have selected, we will start, we will also identify how the data has to be collected for these inventories, and then we will start collecting the data and putting it in these inventories. We will have some data which will be missing or some data which is inaccurate. Once we go ahead with this process, we would identify that where the data is missing or what more data is required, and we will continue to put that data, compile that data in the form of this inventory which we have already identified. And as I said, mentioned earlier, we will choose the emission factors which are there, and finally we will calculate the emissions, which is the second part of second step of this, which is to collect data and quantify GHG emissions. We have to do it for baseline year and every year then on till the target year, and then we can select a new baseline year and then go on to set up another target. So, the baseline years can also continue to change and the target years can also continue to change. It is totally up to the company, because this is a voluntary reporting. Nobody is forcing this reporting onto a company. And as I had mentioned earlier also, again, anything that you will be able to measure is something that you will be able to manage, and it is also something that we value. So, for example, today we stop metering the electricity usage. The moment we stop metering the electricity usage, our usage will go haywire and we stop valuing it, even if we have to pay for it, and then of course payment becomes difficult because there is no measurement of it. The same is with, for example, attendance percentage in colleges. So, we have this minimum 75%, but if we stop measuring it, even if the 75% attendance rule is there, we will probably not be able to achieve it because there is no measuring. So, what we value, we measure, and what we measure is what we manage. With this principle, we will go ahead and collect and quantify the GHG emissions. So, what we have seen the first step as identify the sources, that is part of the inventory identification. We go ahead and select the calculation approach. How do we calculate? And then we collect the data and choose emission factors, we apply it and we put up that data. This is within the corporate that we put up to the higher authorities. Now, how do we identify these emissions? We have to define that what you are making as net zero carbon. So, defining the boundaries. We will see that where all net zero concept can really be applied. So, often we can not apply the net zero concept to the entire organization boundary or the entire operational boundary. It could be done, but for bigger organizations it is difficult. So, we can also identify these smaller boundaries within the operational or organizational boundary. So, of a parent company owning some 50 odd different subsidiary companies, we can define that in the first go we are making this particular company X as a net zero company, and then go ahead with that. And then we identify the greenhouse gas emissions of various activities, both upstream as well as downstream, and the direct emissions that are there in between, identifying their global warming potential for different materials that are going to be used, different activities that are going to be performed. So, basically the choices that we have, as I have been mentioning, from a petroleum product based transportation fleet to an electric vehicle fleet. So, we always have options of selection. When we are making buildings, when we are moving into buildings, we can always have the selection of choice of materials. So, whether we want to go for a fired clay brick or a CSEB or an AAC block. So, what is the embodied carbon, or what is the GHG emission which is there associated with the product, and also then the thermal comfort and all. And then this is what to do. We are talking about what to do. How to really do it, that we have to formalize data collection procedures. So, we have to know how to collect the data, what to collect, and then we process it, we document it and we process it. So, here we are talking about the inventory management plan. We have already identified the inventory, we have collected the data, and now when we have all that data together, we put it all together and identify how to manage this inventory, the quality of this inventory, which has to be done for several years down the line continuously, because we are talking about a target year from a baseline year. So, it has to be continuously managed, not just managed, we also have to achieve the target of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So, how do we do that? We have to identify those points where emissions can be reduced. So, for that a framework would be required. We have to both maintain the quality of the management plan, correct data should come in. A lot of times these intelligent buildings and smart buildings will have sensors in the beginning, but gradually as the time passes by and the sensors continue to die, there is no proper reporting or there is no proper monitoring whether the data that is being fed is correctly fed or it is coming from all the sources wherever the data points are required to be managed. So, that is where we have to have a mechanism in place for quality checks, whether the quality of the data that is coming in is correct, calibration of these sensors, calibration of these meters. So, these through these quality checks we will continuously have an inflow of the of correct data. So, good data quality, and once we have the regular data coming in and analyzing the data to see that okay, where are we really getting most of the emissions from and where can the reductions happen. So, basically analysis and then feedback. For example, we have a building space, maybe an office, and then we have say a type A of air conditioning system, and then the information tells us that a lot of energy is actually going into conditioning the space. So, we can actually improve upon the coefficient of performance, the performance of the air conditioning system, and from the market we collect the data and see that from this HVAC type A, if we move to HVAC type C, we will be able to save a lot of energy. But at the same time we also have to understand whether it works with other components equally efficiently or not, and then we decide, take a call, get approvals, arrange for finances and change it and see whether it is working efficiently or not, because we will go over a lot of these concepts, but there are several components within an HVAC, central HVAC. There could be a chiller, there could be a condenser unit, there could be pumps, a lot of these things, but changing just one component, will it bring energy efficiency, which it promised to do that. That again we will have to look at in the numbers, which we have monitored and metered over years. So, we will say after changing the component and before changing the component. So, there is a feedback that has to be given, whether it works, it worked or not, and then if yes, going ahead with it, continuously monitoring and assessing, analyzing it. If not, then we have to give a feedback and then make necessary actions, do necessary actions and make changes. So, this is like a continuous process which will continue to go on starting from the base year till the target year, till the target has been achieved. And so, here we are talking about the emission reduction target, which we had simultaneously along with the baseline identification. We have to decide which will be the target year, decide the target and then how to achieve that target. So, track the progress is what we have to continuously monitor and track. Now, all this when we are doing to set a target and achieve a certain target, this we are talking about within an organization. Now, as an individual, I can't achieve this if we do not have the target set as company's goals. So, we have to have the entire management of the company agree on setting a certain target and also achieving that, because if you remember the risks when they were we were talking about associated risks of climate change and emissions, we were talking about the transition costs. The company has to be ready to pay the transition cost from transitioning from a high emitting company to a low emitting company, because this might require changing the entire production unit or changing an entire machinery unit. Now, there the commitment from the company towards achieving the target, towards fulfilling the target is required, because it will require a lot of funding. So, the company has to agree to that. And why will a company do that? Because together these organizations, GHG protocol, ISO, IPCC, UNFCCC, they are actually the bodies of all these parties, which are nations, and nations are coming together, building a consensus, agreeing to limit the global warming by 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial levels and all that. That is what we are doing. So, building up that consensus so that the companies are motivated and driven to reduce their emissions, and through policies nations can drive that change too, reducing, setting targets for the companies to reduce the emissions, and that is where the companies will be motivated. It is right now voluntary. Gradually, as the situations become grave, they might become serious, there could be mandates, there could be compulsory targets to be achieved by each company, and there before that the company itself can have targets and can work towards fulfilling them. This is the overall environment that we are talking about. So, I will stop here, and in tomorrow's lecture we will be talking about scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, which we have kindly set a set a stage here about the organizational and operational boundaries, and we know how to identify, where to identify direct and indirect emissions. So, we will look at many more examples of different companies which have already reported their emissions and how they have classified and categorized their direct and indirect emissions into scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So, that is what we will see in the remaining 2 lectures of this week. So, thank you very much for joining me in this lecture. I hope that you are able to follow up and understand the concepts that we are discussing. If you have any problems, you can post your questions on the forum, and I will try to answer to the best of my ability, and I just hope that you are gaining some knowledge out of these lectures. Thank you very much for being with me. Bye bye.